Now, the Gates Foundation also has a sunset clause, but it's a bit longer, maybe 75 years?
Yeah, it could be less.
Something like that. So, right now, given the financial crisis we're in, are you protecting your reserves, Jeff, or are you spending? Tell us about what you're doing.
No, I would say that we're certainly very conscious of how the economic crisis is shaping the investment markets. But if you look at what the Gates Foundation has done over the last 4 years, effectively, Bill and Melinda and I chose to continue to grow, even though the assets have come down. That's because we are very much invested in long-term initiatives like the eradication of polio, the eradication of malaria. And these are things that you can't just decide to drop. If investment returns are down, then that means we are bringing down the assets.
Right, but you're happy to do that.
We're happy to do that because, as we said, we will spend out, and in the long term, we think that this is the right set of decisions to make for long-term investment.
Piero, what about you? Your situation is completely different.
Undoubtedly, like most other Italian foundations, we have been quite badly hit when it comes to the total market value of our assets. But this has not translated into a parallel reduction of our grant making, in the sense that we have deliberately decided to keep a higher payout ratio. So we are under the obligation to spend, but we can decide what is the time frame in which to spend. And so definitely in the, let's say, fat years up to 2008, we have been setting aside reserves which are helping us to stabilize grants. And actually, if you look at the flows, the real flows, the last years have been even more generous than the previous years, exactly as a result of spending down, so to say, the reserves we have been trying to build in the past. So in a way, we have been deliberately counter-cyclical, even if definitely we are, so to say, long-term institution. I mean, we have a long record, as you're saying. Next year it will be our 450th anniversary. And I think that there are obviously excellent reasons for having both kind of institutions. I mean, in a society, you need both entities which are clearly focused on very specific purposes and have a time limit. But at the same time, I think that it's good for a community to know that there is somewhere a kind of permanent, stable pillar they can rely upon. We have been a kind of quiet force behind the community we are embedded in. Here, talking about Belfast, how exactly many of the problems which have to do with normal communities or with communities which have been particularly wounded by past events, I mean, need long-term approaches in the sense that it's not something that you can define as, okay, it's solved. I mean, it's a constant adjustment work.
It's very tempting, though, isn't it? Very tempting indeed to look at immediate needs and say, you know, we can see that, we can fix that, we can help these people here and now. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on foundations to do exactly that. How do you deal with that kind of pressure, Piero?
Well, we try to deal with that, but it's a permanent pressure, I think, on any foundation. Above all, it's a pressure on those foundations which, in a way or another, describe themselves as belonging to a community, which means that there is, I mean, a limited but relevant population of stakeholders, so to say. We're obviously putting pressure on you. I would say that, as in many other cases, it's a matter of balance. I mean, you have to be able to give short-term answers because otherwise you will probably lose the grip. I mean, you will not be able to create enough consensus around the policies you're following if there are no visible and tangible results also in the short term. But at the same time, you should not lose the focus on the longer term. And in order to do that, obviously, we have to combine different tools and different approaches. And fundamentally, one of the things we have been learning through the crisis is that we need a closer integration of different facets of our activity. So advocacy should go closer in hands with policy-oriented research, and experimentation should go, once again, hand in hand with research, and at the same time, meeting some of the needs in more immediate ways is also a way to experiment and to find probably better solutions.
In our strategic framework, we do allocate a certain amount of funding for local community needs and for emergency response. So when there's a humanitarian crisis in, maybe it's an earthquake in Haiti or something like that, then we do have some funding available, and so we have that as part of our overall strategic framework. Yet you also have to have the courage of your convictions. With the downturn in the economy in the United States and the consequent cut in government funding for homeless, we actually had a protest at the Gates Foundation that we should do more for chronic homelessness. And in fact, the Gates Foundation does about $100 million over the last few years in family homelessness. Now, we happen to choose a particular area where we feel we can make a catalytic difference. And I think we have to have the courage of our convictions that we need to keep on the path and not undercut our funding of the family homelessness because of the external pressures.
Governments tend to listen when the Gates Foundation has something to say. Do you have to listen back? Do they tell you what they'd like you to do?
Oh, absolutely. I think it is very important that we have a good dialogue. In our vision of catalytic philanthropy, which I'll just say is one of three segments that we think about. In catalytic philanthropy, we think our responsibility is to undertake some of the underlying risk of developing innovative interventions that the private sector wouldn't develop because they don't see a market opportunity, and that the public sector won't invest in because they don't want to take the risk. So I think catalytic philanthropy is one leg of a three-legged stool that works together with those two sectors. So as Astrid said, I think the multi-sector thinking is very important, and we have that. And our goal is to develop, is to take on that risk and have some successes and then show the evidence of those successes so that they can be scaled up and sustained by the private sector if we do show there's a market opportunity, and or the public sector if we show that it's a better allocation of public resource.
It's increasingly difficult to imagine that someone will take the job after you started something innovative and risky. Governments are much more engaged in the process of shedding out rather than taking in. And we have to be aware, and that has to do exactly with risk propension, that when we start something, we have to be there for the long term. Which means that the amount of innovation you can introduce is limited, at least in our case. We need to rethink institutional designs on a larger scale. But in order to do so, you have to be aware of the fact that you have to be there for the long haul, and to be there, you have to be sustainable. And sometimes risk enters into conflict with sustainability.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open up to the floor, because I'm sure many of you have things you'd like to say or ask about. My last question, which of my several would I like to ask? There's a paradox about wealth and about foundations. Are we not setting a good enough example for philanthropists? Why aren't the ultra-rich setting up foundations? Wouldn't that be really cool? Have we not shown them that this is a good way to do things?
It's very important that wealthy, or as you describe, ultra-wealthy people make a commitment to philanthropy, and Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett have been very active in encouraging that. And I think one of the things that they would tell you is that for a lot of the folks that are thinking about starting their foundation, they recognize it's not easy. It's challenging. You know, how do you think about what will be the role of your children? How do you think about what's the structure? Where do you invest? So I think the thing that perhaps we can do more of in order to encourage it is to really help a broader set of people, including those so-called ultra-wealthy, understand how to have more and higher quality impact via philanthropy.
Okay, that's a good note. Piero.
You see, most of the ultra-wealthy are not to be found in Italy, but those which are there didn't give a very encouraging example, I would say. Let me put it bluntly. If you are looking for redistribution, voluntary redistribution doesn't go very far. You have to look for politics, you have to look for good old taxes, because otherwise there will not be a significant amount of reduction of inequality.
Yes.